And good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. I am Craig Trulia, and with me tonight is Father John Whiteford. Father John, it's great to have you tonight.
Good to be on.
Now, Father John, this is a topic you chose, and I think it's fortuitous because it's right before Election Day next Tuesday and has to do with cultural Marxism in the church. And so, how about we just start with very simply, what on earth is cultural Marxism?
Well, when you talk about cultural Marxism, you'll have some people say, oh, that's just a right-wing conspiracy theory. And they'll say that the term was invented by the Nazis and that sort of stuff. But the thing is you can find people who were advocating for cultural Marxism, referring to it as such in published academic literature long before recent times. It wasn't just some term that was invented in the last 5 years or something. And it really it's a way of quibbling and trying to deflect from what we're talking about, because Marxism obviously is, there's a lot of streams in Marxist thought, but they're all trying to get to a similar goal, which is basically some utopian society where there's no private property and the state makes everything equal and just, and everybody lives happily ever after. There were actually communists before Marx wrote Das Kapital, so it even predates Marx himself. There are lots of streams of Marxist thought, but in the 1920s and 30s, you had a group of Marxists that started advocating for an approach to Marxism that focused on the culture. So if you want to call it something else, it doesn't really matter, but that's really what it's focused on. It's a Marxist approach that's trying to divide and conquer via the culture rather than via economics. You had Antonio Gramsci in Italy, who came to the conclusion that Marxist theory that the proletariat was going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie wasn't coming to fruition because the proletariat had too much of an investment in the culture. They bought into the religion and the traditions of the culture, and they weren't ready to just burn it all down and start from scratch like the communists wanted them to. So he began to argue that there had to be an infiltration of the institutions of the culture, and basically that people, Marxists needed to take over the culture so that they would then be able to convince the proletariat that they needed to go in a Marxist direction. Later on, it was referred to by, I think it was a German Marxist, as the Long March Through the Institution. Sometimes people attribute that title to Antonio Gramsci, but obviously he wouldn't have came up with that title because it's alluding to an event in China that happened after his time, which was basically, there was a period before World War II where the Chinese nationalists had the communists on the run and almost destroyed them, but they went on what they called later the Long March, where they retreated into the mountains and were able to regroup and eventually gain enough strength to where after World War II they were able to take over the country. And so that's the allusion to that phrase. But the idea is that it's going to take a long time, but gradually Marxists need to work on taking over the institutions. Now, does that mean that everybody who's involved in promoting Marxism in the institutions is part of some secret society and learns secret handshakes and has a decoder ring and all that kind of stuff? I don't believe that's true. But basically, this idea is something that has percolated through academia, and it particularly came to the United States via what's called the Frankfurt School. There were a group of scholars that were in Frankfurt, Germany, before the Nazis took over, and basically came to the same ideas or similar ideas to Antonio Gramsci, that you had to focus on the culture. And they left Germany because the Nazis took over and they came to the United States. And in particular, they first came to Columbia University and then later spread out to other universities in the United States. But they became very influential. And particularly when they came to the United States, they saw the futility of trying to promote class warfare in the United States, because they discovered that even poor Americans consider themselves to be temporarily embarrassed millionaires, and that if they worked hard enough and with a little bit of luck, they could strike it rich. So you couldn't appeal to people with the idea that, look, the deck stacked against you, you have no chance of being prosperous, and so you need to join forces with us and overthrow the rich people. But what they did discover is that a weak spot in American culture was in particular the issue of race. So they developed critical race theory, and critical theory is usually attributed to the Frankfurt School in terms of its origin. But critical race theory, just to give a brief idea of what it is for those that may not know, is if you're approaching any issue from critical theory, you're trying to find who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. And then basically you're trying to advocate and use your platform as a scholar to advance the cause of the oppressed and to overthrow the oppressor. And then that was applied in other areas. And then eventually you wind up with the idea of intersectionality, where you've got other oppressed groups. You've got women who are oppressed. You've got homosexuals that are oppressed. You got left-handed lesbians who are of color that are oppressed. And so these are all different oppressed groups. And so they need to work together to overthrow the group that's in power, which in particular is the white male, Christian especially. And so this is where you get these ideas of white guilt. Systemic racism is a phrase that they like to throw around. And if you want to talk about what is systemic racism, just as an aside, I think that it's a fair term to use if it's used fairly. But so, for example, if you're talking about apartheid in South Africa, or if you're talking about Jim Crow laws in the United States in the past, you could say, well, that's a systemic example of racism. That's where you had systems in place that were rooted in racism, that were designed to keep a certain group in a particular state, which was not to their own advantage. And but the idea of systemic racism is that everything is systemic racism. Racism is just permeating the entire society. And so basically you're never going to get away from it. And if you're white, you're already judged to be a racist. The only thing that you can do is acknowledge your white guilt and become a advocate for the oppressed. And then even though you still have the guilt.
Well, I'll interject this though. Systemic racism only exists if you're not successful. So on the books, perhaps the most legally oppressed class of people in the United States are Asians, particularly East Asians, because of their test scores. Their average income is the highest as a group of people, even though percentage-wise, many are recent immigrants. And so if you're successful and thereby you're doing well in the system, systemic racism is not a big deal for you. It's a big deal for those who want to get a piece of the pie, so to say. So it's not a very consistent ideology for what it's worth.
It certainly is interesting that because Asians tend to be more successful than white people in this country, that they're almost made honorary white people by the people who want to advocate for systemic racism. Although you have a lot of Asians that have bought into this stuff, and they'll talk about their own oppression or try to concoct some story of oppression for themselves to join in on the fun, so to speak, and blaming the white majority for whatever problems they may have. But the reality of it is Asians are kicking everybody's butt when it comes to economics, when it comes to academics. You actually have in Harvard they are more biased against Asians getting into Harvard than they are to white people, and they try to promote anybody who is a minority into coming into Harvard. So basically, they're tipping the scales, and it's not a merit-based approach. I know when I was in high school, partly on a lark and partly because there was this oral tradition in my family that we had some Native American heritage, which genealogically I think I've established, but my DNA test, it's so far back that my DNA test doesn't pick it up. But anyway, when I took the pre-SAT test, I checked that I was a Native American, partly just as a lark. And I got letters from every college in the United States trying to offer me scholarships to go there. So that's racist America for you. If you're any kind of a minority, particularly if you're a Native American, which obviously they have a long history of not being treated very well in this country, and a lot of Native Americans are still very poor to this day, and they've not succeeded very well. It depends on the tribe and the part of the country, but a Native American who does halfway decent on an SAT test is going to be offered scholarships to just about anywhere he wants to go. Whereas if you're an Asian and you do just as well on the SAT test, you might get some attention, but it certainly wouldn't be on the same level. And
you're speaking from experience. You did
yes.
halfway decent on the test.
Right.
So that's how you know.
Right. So, and I, if I'd have been Elizabeth Warren, I would have gone ahead and taken one of those scholarships. But being a little less brazen and having less chutzpah, I thought, I'm going to get into trouble if I actually try to go ahead with getting a scholarship based on this. So I didn't go down that route, and I started checking that I was just a Caucasian so that I wouldn't run the risk. But Elizabeth Warren probably has as much Native American ancestry as I do, or less, and she got a job as a professor at Harvard as a result of it. So I could have played along and gotten away with it. She's blonde haired and blue eyed. At least I had brown hair before I turned gray and brown eyes, so I could have passed a little bit more easily.
It's my stereotype of all white people that have been in this country since before the Civil War is all of them are some sort of Native American. All of them, when you go far enough in their ancestry. My family, no, they're more recent European immigrants. But I think your family's been in Texas for a real long time, if I remember your story. So it would make sense.
Part of it goes back before the Civil War, but my family goes through Virginia and South Carolina, and there's lots of branches throughout the South on my father's side of the family. My mother's side of the family is more of the Plymouth Rock, north part of the country's history. But I did the math because I have a connection with Pocahontas's father, according to the genealogies that I've been looking at. But if you do the math, I think it's 14 generations removed from me to that Native American ancestor. And that means that it's such a small percentage of chance that I would have any DNA that would have been passed on that it wouldn't show up. The exception would have been if I was a direct male descendant. In other words, if I had a male line to that ancestor, then my Y chromosome would tell the story. And if I had a maternal direct connection, my mitochondrial DNA would have told the story. But otherwise, it's just random DNA that gets passed on. And it's just too small of a percentage.
I mean, I'm sure God finds this mildly humorous, but obviously this is not, when you say it in those terms, it's not important, right? It's our soul that's important, and not all this slicing and dicing of ethnic groups, which are in some respects arbitrary, because they have to delineate if this is the DNA of this or that ethnic group. Well, who are you getting it from? No one's 100%. I mean, statistically. So it's
right. And the thing of it is, if you go back far enough and you do a DNA test, most people would find that there's at least some non-European ancestry, even if they're blonde hair and blue eyed. My Y chromosome actually goes back through Scotland, but then back to Syria. And the most likely explanation is you have a Roman soldier who was on Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall, which actually is the most likely story in my opinion, because the Whiteford family comes from right around where the Antonine Wall was. And then if you go back even further than that, the type of a Y chromosome that I have is actually the most common Y chromosome in Africa. So, I could claim African heritage through that, because it is if you go back 10,000 years, it's an African Y chromosome. And I think most people would discover, Adolf Hitler had Jewish ancestry that showed up, when his family has, since DNA has been discovered, relatives of his have done DNA tests. And he actually belongs to a group that's distantly connected to the one that I'm a part of. But so it has some roots, but ultimately African roots.
As for Hitler, that's why the pretty much the Nazi laws made it where if you're less than a quarter Jewish, you could claim full German ancestry, because it would be positively absurd to look for someone absolutely pure, because there were enough Jews in Germany where someone's great-great-grandfather married, a Jewish woman or something like that. And there's a reason why Ashkenazi Jews have blonde hair, blue eyes. If you look at me, I'm not taken after my Italian father. I'm taken after my Jewish mother, and clearly it looks more like German features. But I'll say this: when you go back to DNA, which would be on my father's side, who is convinced he was 100% Italian. There's Greek and Southern European and North African, because Southern Italy would have been Byzantine until the early 1000s, when the Normans finally took over. And even to this day in Southern Italy, there's the Greco people, though they've long lost most of their Greek heritage. So somewhere way back in Italy, my father's side, there would have been Orthodox people.
The history of the human race is a history of people moving around and people intermarrying. And obviously, the idea of race, as we now think of it, is a fairly modern concept. Now, the idea of ethnos is an ancient concept, but your ethnicity or an ethnos is an ethnic group. But with that way of thinking, you would say that an Italian and a German were different ethnicities because they were different ethnic groups, even though to the eye they would look very similar because they would be both Caucasian. And even in any ethnic group, that unless they've been very isolated by history, like maybe the Aborigines before European settlers came there, you're going to find that there's been intermixing on some level. It's not everybody that, it's not most people, their ancestry would be like maybe 99% whatever the ethnic group is, but you generally are going to find at least a 1% back far enough that mixes in with some other ethnic group. And so the idea of race that we have today it's not biblical. It's certainly not the way the church looks at it. And and I would just say, for anyone who's wondering, I've written quite a bit about racism, and racism is a sin, because what racism is looking at somebody just purely on the basis of their racial characteristics and either hating them or treating them differently, and particularly in the context of the church. There is no distinction that we make between different ethnic groups. We have national churches, but like in Russia, for example, you'll see Asian-looking people all over the place because there's a lot of different ethnic groups inside Russia. There are multiple languages that are used inside the Russian church. So it's not a racial thing to have a national church. It's just sort of a territorial thing.
Well, and let me talk about that, because this has been an issue that getting to modern times with the growth of nationalism, which is really a 19th century ideology, and this idea of race that arose out of this, and then eventually psychological constructs and stuff that they come up to explain this. That's had an effect on Orthodoxy, because we have it now that, churches have been always under Serbia don't want to be under Serbia. Churches that have always been under Moscow don't want to be under Moscow, and everyone wants to be divided along endless racial lines. And the fact that did not occur until the late 1800s shows this is not something historically part of the Christian experience in the Orthodox Church.
Right. And the
And
idea of having, like, for example, there were Serbian refugees into Russia when the Turks took over Serbia. And St. John of Shanghai, as a matter of fact, descended from them. His name is a Serbian surname. And you had Greeks that went into Russia after the fall of Constantinople. And so the famous Russian general, I think it was Kutuzov, if I'm remembering correctly, who won the War of 1812 and beat back Napoleon's invasion, he descended from Greeks. But they didn't have a Greek church in Russia to cater to the Greeks, and they didn't have a Serbian church in Russia to cater to the Serbians that went there. They just had the Russian church. There might have been a time when they maybe even did some services in Greek for people who were refugees. I don't know. And like I said, the Russian church already uses multiple languages. So the idea of serving people in a language that they understand is not something that's a problem. But the idea of dividing up the church by ethnicity is something that's counter to the traditions of the church.
Now, with this, seems to me historically, right, it doesn't look like where something starts, it's where it's going to end. But where it starts, so the church being involved in this sort of worldliness, is with nationalism and splitting among national lines. And that's really in the 19th century and early 20th century. And it'd be past the subject again too. There were some, Orthodox bishops, which are almost practically strong men in Balkan countries before before really the Nazi takeover. But that aside, then the Orthodox Church has already become more of something that is following instead of leading the cultural institutions and the current events, so to say. So what happens?
The church doesn't control the political side of life. And so the fact that if you have a Serbian kingdom that emerges, it makes sense that they would have their own local church. If you have a Romanian state that emerges in the 19th century, it makes sense that eventually they would have their own local church because they speak a language that's not Greek and it's not Slavic. So it makes sense that they would have their own national church. But on the other hand, you have recently in the Balkans, you've had what was a united country, Yugoslavia, breaking up into smaller republics, and you've had attempts to just go into schism and establish a new church in Macedonia or in Montenegro, and the church rejects that idea. And in this case, you're talking about people who are Slavs. In the case of Montenegro, there's really no distinction between them and other Serbs. It's just they have a slightly different history because that was the part of Serbia that the Turks were never able to conquer. But they speak the exact same language as the rest of the Serbs. I think in Macedonia they speak something that's closer to Bulgarian. But down the road, eventually there might be a Macedonian church that everybody recognizes as an autocephalous church. But you don't just go into schism to establish that. But it makes some sense to have churches organized in that way. The same thing if you take the Russian Empire, it may very well be that one day you have a totally autocephalous Ukrainian church, but you don't just, the EP doesn't just get to step in there and make that happen. That's something that the legitimate church in Ukraine would need to start asking for. And then you would need to have the agreement of the rest of the Russian church. And I don't think that's that far-fetched that could happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And probably what the EP did is going to set it back a long ways. And I'm not sure that it even is necessary because Russians and Ukrainians are so close culturally and linguistically that it's not really necessary, but it may eventually happen. And I'm not opposed to it. So, that's in God's hands. But if you had Ukrainians that migrated into Russia and they were trying to establish their own Ukrainian church, even after, there was some autocephalous church in Ukraine, then it would be, something that would be divisive. So you don't want to divide the church. Whatever national, benefit there might be to having a local church, you don't want to have a schism to make that happen because schism is the worst possible sin against the church that you can commit. It's better to maintain unity.
Now, when I went to Columbia University, I was studying education. And so my master's thesis was specifically on textbooks and how they presented history. And one thing that surprised me was textbooks, even with liberal authors, because you would know that some of these scholars were communists and stuff. Like, you could read other books of theirs. And but when they wrote a textbook for high school students, the textbooks themselves tended to actually be conservative. And what we mean by conservative is not like as in they're telling you to vote Republican, because conservatives don't lay it on that thick like liberals. But more so, they didn't say America was awful. It was pretty much a history where America was progressing and getting better and fixing their problems. And sometimes, if you are a critical historian, I mean to think critically, that could be a little silly, right? Making the Civil War into, let's say, a fight between brothers. Like a little scuffle doesn't kill 600,000 people. So sometimes it could be way overly simplistic, but it worked the purpose of giving Americans, which come from all different groups and backgrounds, a cogent ideology and something to be proud of. And so even liberal scholars would write relatively conservative textbooks until about the 1990s.
Yeah.
And what I saw at that point is the textbooks all became divided into lines of race and gender. What did this gender do in this era in history? So you'd be reading about Mexicans in the Revolutionary War. And let's be honest, you really got to really suffer to find like a Mexican guy who was important in the Revolutionary War. It doesn't mean they didn't exist, because Spain was an ally later in the Revolutionary War. But the point is that until fairly recently, even the regular teacher in history in the regular classroom, the university has gone far left, even in the 30s and stuff. So we could talk about it in a second. But until fairly recently, you wouldn't get that at the average school with average middle class, working class people. And I've been out of this now for 15 years. I guarantee a textbook made in 2020 would have LGBTQ whatever in history, which wouldn't even be really relevant. Let's say Revolutionary War, Civil War, or something. So I say that to show this is how education has changed, because that's what my background is academically. When did these sort of overtures started making their way into the Orthodox Church, where we have, let's say, Fordham University criticized? If it's St. Vlad's, people would expect that they're going to agree with liberal Protestants, liberal Roman Catholics with a lot of their ideas. And quite frankly, among a lot of Orthodox academe, the sort of conversations you and I would have would be considered kind of stuffy and backward. So when did that change?
Well, I think it was back in the 60s when you had sort of this radical movement that started taking over the student body of a lot of universities. And then those people eventually, a fair number of them wound up going into academia themselves. And so about the time that they would have gotten into positions where they had tenure, and particularly when they would have felt like they had enough support from other people in their respective departments, that's when they began to come out of the closet, so to speak, and show who they really were. And so it's been a gradual process. And going back to this idea of this all being a conspiracy theory, whether how much credit you give to Antonio Gramsci's ideas for the fact that universities have been taken over by people with Marxist ideology or not, the fact is that's what's happened. So whether he was responsible for making it happen or whether it just happened by some random chance, it's happened. I tend to think that it probably didn't just happen by accident. So it's become an increasing problem. When I went to college, I graduated from college in 1990 myself, and I went to my first semester. I went to the University of Houston. And even back then, this was in 1986, in the spring semester. Even back then, they had like the atheist communist league handing out literature and selling books on the sidewalks, and the gay atheist doing that kind of stuff too. And it was so even the University of Houston back then was already shifting in a lot of respects to the left. but I went to college I got to know a Chinese woman who was in the graduate program, getting an education, master's degree, and then she went on to work on her PhD in California. And I met her again when I went to California to go to the glorification of St. John. So my wife and I had lunch with her, and she was telling us about some of the stuff that's happened since she got there. And she had a daughter. And in California, it's long been the case that if you spoke another language other than English in the home, you had the right to have your child taught in that language in the public schools. And she, getting her PhD in education, studied this issue, and she had a class in bilingual education. So she wrote a paper, and this woman was a genius, mind you. She was a graduate of Beijing University, and there's so much competition in China to get into that university. You have to be a genius even to step foot on the, as a freshman.
And that's why if people wonder we're flooded with so many Chinese students, those are people that have money, but they weren't genius enough to get into a Chinese school. It's not because we're so desirable.
But this woman, when I knew her in college, she was taking something like 15 graduate hours a semester. And, if you know anything about graduate work, you don't take that many graduate classes normally. And she complained to me. I remember she was talking about one class, because she was amazed at how fluffy the education department was. And this was a private Christian college, mind you. But she told me about one class where when it came finals time, the professor said, well, what do y'all want to do for the final? And somebody said, well, let's have a party. And so the professor said, okay, let's have a party. So the final exam was showing up for a party. And these are the people that you're training to educate our youth. And you wonder why nobody's getting an education in this country. I mean, it's just amazing. But anyway, she took this class of bilingual education, wrote a paper in which she argued that bilingual education was actually stunning the learning of the students that were involved in it. The best thing to do would be to immerse children in English so that they could be successful. And she wound up getting a B for the course. So she went to the professor as a result of this paper. So she went to the professor and said, why did I get a B? And basically, it wasn't because she didn't footnote her work. It wasn't because of any other issue. It was she was told, because you came to the wrong conclusion. You don't understand bilingual education because you came to the wrong conclusion. So this is where academia is headed, and it's all because the whole focus.
A bilingual person doesn't understand bilingual education.
Yeah, because she didn't agree with that a bilingual education was important. So basically, academia has been taken over by ideologues. You can't have a free and open discussion on issues that they think are important anymore, because you have to come to the right conclusions. It's all indoctrination. It's not thinking. It's not debate. It's not you put your ideas on the table and I'll put my ideas on the table and we'll have a debate and we'll see who makes the most sense. It's I'm right and you're wrong, and if you don't agree with me, I'll just destroy you. I'll blackball you, make sure that you don't get a job in academia so that you can't spread your views, and I'll be able to spread mine. And that's where we are. And
when I was in college, I pretty much pretended to be a far lefty. In fact, if you Google my name, you'll find one of the journals that I edited, and it was a social justice journal. And so you pretty much have to do that. If you want good grades, if you want to get ahead, you can't let them know you have a conservative political ideology or that you're religious or anything like that. And
the thing is, we went from having that kind of stuff where there was sort of like, you knew that if you argued or if you came out as a conservative that you might get bad grades, to where now you've got people wanting to run you off the campus if you don't agree with them. And to destroy you. And we've gotten to the point now where we have people who've gone through those universities marching in the streets trying to riot, destroy property, because they're trying to have a Marxist revolution. I mean, so that's the fruit of all these years of indoctrination that we're seeing in the country right now. And even though cultural Marxism is not the exact same as the Marxism that Lenin would have recognized. Certainly Che Guevara was a big-time racist, so he wouldn't have been in keeping with critical race theory, although that he gets a pass because he was a commie, and you see all these people wearing his image on their shirts. But the end goal is the same, and it's a totalitarian state where they control all the means of production, and you do exactly what the state tells you to do. It's all central planning. It's all the smart people telling you what to do, and you doing whatever they tell you to do, and them using terror to get you to adhere. And that's the scary part. That's where we're headed as a country if we don't wake up.
If people aren't aware, but the communists weren't exactly very socially progressive in a lot of stuff. Homosexuality was illegal in the Soviet Union. In Cuba, it was illegal until the 1980s.
I think it's still illegal in China.
It's true, though. They're starting to reverse that locally, but mostly for people that are actually like Westerners doing business in China.
Right.
So that's true. It's if you had HIV in Cuba until I think at least the 2000s, they would lock you up in a concentration camp.
Right.
So if you had HIV, they would persecute you. They were not particularly conservative when it comes to egalitarian. When it comes to men and women issues, I would say the Soviet Union probably had better racial relations than, let's say, after Stalin, obviously, than we had. And some
it depends on the race.
It's interesting when you speak to people in the former Soviet Union, they'd even say, we didn't think of ourselves as much as Georgians or as much as, Kazakhs or whatever. That's something that came more after.
That's generally true. And of course, you had Black Americans that went to the Soviet Union and would rave about how well they were treated. And that's because if you go to a country where there's never been any history of racial animosity against Black people, then you're not going to experience that there. But it didn't mean that they had a superior society to ours. It just means that they didn't have that particular issue.
Oh no, that's not my point. There's a great interview online with a Black woman who grew up in Hamburg because her parents were entertainers, and so she grew up in Hamburg during World War II, and she had nothing but nice things to say about the Germans. Said, but they're Nazis, and she's like, well. But it didn't matter who you are. If you messed with them, they'd throw you in the camp. So like she didn't see anything race related. She said she didn't see racism until she went to the United States.
Right.
And so I say that not because an idiot would interpret this, that America was more racist than the Germans, because clearly it's not the case. We weren't annihilating our racial minorities like the Germans were. It shows you it depends who you are and where you are, and that will determine how that particular person is treated. But that aside, the question would be, how did it start changing in America? I want to share a screen, and I had it up for a little bit, which would be this book, which I had to learn about at Columbia University, which is Dare the School Build the New Social Order. It was made in the 1930s. George S. Counts is the author. He's a communist. You read it, it's kind of laughable, the sort of stuff that they kind of Huey Long sort of stuff. They thought that, there's factories now. Everyone could have a radio, one car, and a 2-bedroom house, and there will be no reason for strike because everyone will be happy. And clearly everyone has that now. They have way more than that now, and they're not happy, and that includes people on Social Security benefits. But why do I bring this up? Look at the title of that book. The idea of the schools being a force for indoctrination, not for education, but a force for social change, was this kind of new idea in the 30s. The fact that now we just accept that's the fact, it was still a new idea 15 years ago when I was taught this book, which one of my coworkers has, so I don't have the prop to swing around tonight. But the point is if we want to know how it started changing the United States, is people like George S. Counts very intentionally sought to take over the system of education throughout the country. Now, he wasn't the first. There's John Dewey. There was progressive era intellectuals, but they weren't full-blown communists. They're just far leftist. But this was something that they were behind for a long time, and they slowly but surely started taking over all the universities. First, the Ivy Leagues, and then so on and so forth. I actually remember seeing a World War I era political cartoon, and it criticized. It's not World War I. Though World War I, they did complain about communists in the Ivy League schools. But there's a political cartoon making fun of FDR's cabinet, and they say commie pinkos from Harvard, right? So in the 30s, it was well known that the communists have already infiltrated academia. So once you get to the 50s and 60s, they have totally taken over at that point. And so everyone in the position of power today was educated essentially by far left wingers and from communists. And when we have a seminary system where half of everyone has education before they go to seminary in these far left training camps, and then the seminaries themselves want to hire people with good academic credentials, but that means you've went through these brainwashing camps. It's not very surprising if you start having far left ideology in all the churches, not just the Orthodox Church. So being that you're a priest, I could give you the background I have from education, but what have you seen firsthand? What is your take on what has happened in Orthodox education and how it's affected dialogue within Orthodoxy since the 1960s?
Well, I mean, the Orthodox in the United States tend to be relatively well off compared to the average American, which means that we've got more than our share of people who have gone through Ivy League institutions and gotten this kind of indoctrination. Several years ago, I spoke at a St. Herman's youth conference in New York, and we had a breakout session where we were talking in smaller groups. And I remember these students talking about how in every class they were being indoctrinated at that time on the gay marriage issue. But now I'm sure it's the social justice, Black Lives Matter stuff that's the cause celeb of the moment. But it reminds me of a story about a Russian woman whose family had gone to Iran to escape the Bolshevik Revolution, and under the Shah, Iran was a very liberal, in the good sense, country to be in. And she went to like a Zoroastrian school, which was very tolerant. But then the Iranian Revolution happened, which, even though it was Islamic, it also had a lot of Marxist influence too. I remember their symbol at the time of the revolution was like an AK-47 with a sickle, and it looked an awful lot like the hammer and the sickle. But anyway, this article I read that she wrote, she managed to get out eventually, but she was talking about how she was in a class like on algebra or something in college, and the professor just kept going on and on about the ideology of the revolution. And at one point she stood up and said, "Can't we just study algebra?" or whatever the subject was. And she walked out of the class, and like almost every other student walked out of the class. Well, then she was arrested not long thereafter because she was obviously marked as a counter-revolutionary. And her story beyond then, she suffered many years of severe abuse as a result of that, and threats to her family. But that's where we're headed in this country. We're not there 100%. The being thrown in prison part hasn't started happening yet, but we're not very far removed from that once these people get into power. You can talk about the Constitution and constitutional protections all you want, but the Constitution is only as good as the people who are charged with enforcing what it says. If people choose to interpret the Constitution to mean that all the guns get to be rounded up and there can be no hate speech and you can't go to church anymore because there might be a virus there or something, they can interpret the Constitution and say, and basically deny everything that it actually was written to do and take away all your freedoms. The Soviet Union's Constitution was actually based on the United States Constitution. It had almost every protection, at least on paper, that our Constitution gave us. It's just they had no intention of actually enforcing it when the party's interests were not being promoted. So don't be foolish enough to think it can't happen here. In 1917 in Russia, I'm sure there were a lot of people before the revolution that would have said it could never happen here, and then it did. So don't think that. And coming from talking a little bit more about the infiltration inside the church. If you take a look at public orthodoxy, there's so much that you can see in the articles that are written there that are influenced by this kind of thinking. They're always advocating for the oppressed minority, the LGBTQ, the left-handed, transgendered, black, woman trapped in a white man's body or whatever. And they're always looking for the oppressed and trying to overthrow the oppressors, which are whatever is, the mainstream. And so, as a matter of fact, I wrote an article a few years ago about an article they had that was written by the daughter of a priest, and she teaches at Purdue. And if you look at her bio on the university website, it talks about how she uses critical theory to apply to the church history during the Byzantine period or something like that. But critical theory, and critical theory is a Marxist approach. And I don't know whether she was aware of it when she bought into it hook, line, and sinker, but she did. But basically, the article that she had published in Public Orthodoxy was trying to argue that in the lives and services of certain saints, you could find transgenderism. And as if the monks that wrote this were trying to promote the idea of gender bending. And she's too smart of a woman, I think, to actually believe that. She's just basically willing to distort the truth to promote an agenda that she sees as advocating for an oppressed minority. So this stuff is real, and it's coming into the church. And it's not just the Orthodox Church by any stretch. I think we have a lot of things that help us fight this. We have a lot of people who've experienced communism, and so we have people who are more sensitive to this kind of stuff. If you take a look at the Southern Baptist Church, there are people advocating critical race theory in the Southern Baptist Church, and if you had said that 20 years ago that that's where they would be headed, people would have called you crazy, because they were certainly not that. But they're headed probably for a big split over this issue, because they've got people openly advocating this kind of an ideology. And the thing that people need to keep in mind is, where does this all end? What happens if these people get in charge? And if you know Orthodox Church history, you should know where it all ends. It ends with gulags. It ends with people being lined up and shot. It ends with mass starvation. And I'm familiar with that part of it just from having been an Orthodox Christian since I converted in 1990. But I can also talk from my wife's family experience. My wife was born in the deep south of China, and her parents lived through the Cultural Revolution, and were nearly starved and worked to death in work camps, and managed to, her family managed to get out of the country. And I'm never really been entirely clear how that happened, but they managed to get into Hong Kong in the early 1970s. But they've experienced this kind of stuff. And in China alone, you probably had close to 100 million people that died at the hands of their own government, either by being executed, being worked to death, or being starved in mass planned famines. And it's amazing. Everywhere the communists go, there's a famine that follows, and there's about 10% of the population that winds up dying before it's all said and done. It's either a bad stretch of luck, or it's a part of a strategy. And I think it's more a part of a terror strategy to break the will of a population and get them to come to heel.
And then let me interject, because my wife is also from a former communist country, so she can speak about that. And essentially, she said the schools purposely don't educate because they don't want the people too smart where they can actually overthrow the government. So you always want people stupid. You always want to displace people. So they're always moving people around, displacing people. In Cambodia particularly also, it was just taking all their food away and then exporting that so they could buy weapons, and then killing people off, and then redistributing the land of people.
Right.
They took all the educated people, all the city slickers even, and kicked them out of Phnom Penh, and so kicked them out of the city. But instead of an all history lesson, I'll just say this little story. I remember watching the 1980s version of The Twilight Zone with my wife, and there's a video called it's called Examination Day. People should look it up. And so the whole point is, and I won't tell you everything in the episode, is that the kid's like, oh, the big test is coming. They said, oh, don't worry about it too much. You'll do just fine. And so you don't think much of it. The kid takes the exam. Then you don't know what happens. The parents get a call. Your son passed the test. You could pick up his remains. So the whole idea of the examination was to kill all the smart people. And my wife said very seriously, she said, getting the point, that's exactly what education is in Cambodia.
Well, and
so
Cambodia was a Maoist regime, and they took their cues straight from Mao. And what Mao did was there was a period of time where he lost a lot of influence in the Communist Party. So that's when he started the Red Guard, got them all worked up. So all these young college-age students, like the Antifa of our time, went around and just harassing people, putting dunce caps on them, beating them in the streets, and sometimes killing them, destroying anything that was old, anything that reflected either Western influence or even just traditional Chinese culture, destroying Buddhist temples, destroying ancient Chinese manuscripts. So there's so much Chinese history that was destroyed. And then after Mao successfully was able to use these street thugs to reassert his control over the Communist Party in China, then he started to see the Red Guard as a threat. So then he decided, well, the best education that these people could get would be to send them all out into the country and to have them work. So that's how my father-in-law actually wound up in South China, because he was from Shanghai in the north. He wound up in South China on a work crew and was nearly worked to death. And he wasn't even able to go to college because of all this stuff. And he was an extremely smart man. I taught him how to play Western chess, and he managed to beat me. He didn't beat me consistently, mind you, but he beat me like the second time we played. And I was a pretty good chess player. And he taught me Chinese chess, and he was extremely good at that. So the guy was really smart, but had a very limited education because of the fact that he was born at that time, and Mao didn't like smart people.
And these communists are hypocrites. I mean, in Cambodia, all the ringleaders were educated in France. They're all educated people. They're all well-to-do. That's how they got to France. Right. And so the parallels with that today, you have people that make more money than you by a long shot, are way more educated than the people that they hate. And they're the ones preaching to you about why you should sacrifice, why you should have your churches closed, why you have privilege, but not them, right? The way you look is why you have privilege, or what you believe is why you have privilege. But actually money, no, that don't mean privilege. Access to education, to resources, that doesn't mean privilege, because they have all that.
Well, see, if you parrot their party line, then you're absolved to some extent of your privileged background, although you can never wipe it out entirely. But it's a false religion. There's a really good book that just came out called Social Justice Goes to Church. It's written by John Harris, and he's focused on the evangelical context, but he talks quite a bit. He's got some videos on YouTube that you can watch. He's got a channel called Conversations That Matter. And when he describes the religious element of these folks, you can see it on display, because even secular people notice that a lot of these Black Lives Matter rallies had a religious aspect to them. And so when they go into a restaurant and they start trying to force people to say Black Lives Matter, it's almost like you've got the Inquisition trying to get people to renounce their heresy. It's a fanatical approach, and it's one that if these people get into power, it's not going to be pretty. And St. John of Shanghai, actually not St. John, there was an elder in China by the name of the elder Ignatius of Harbin, who back in the 1930s said that what began in Russia will end in America. And I heard that you can find that as the inscription in the book Russia's Catacomb Saints, which has been out of print for a long time, but you might still be able to find it. But I heard that repeated by people from Harbin that remembered him, or that saying being passed around. And so it may be that that's where we're headed, although I hope there's an ironic meaning that maybe it ending in America means America destroys it. It's not the likely interpretation. But so we need to be prepared for this. We need to start preparing for the fact that we may live to see it. But obviously, we try to do whatever we can to prevent it from happening.
Now, what do we do where so many well-meaning people have seemed to go along with this in the church, right? So we already, in some respects, just so if we're going to go stereotypes, doesn't mean they're true. There's great St. Vlad grads, so there's terrible St. Tikhon grads. There's great Jordanville grads, there's terrible Jordanville grads. So like you can't just point a finger at a single seminary and go, they're to blame.
Right.
But, stereotypically, my ear to the rails, and my godfather went to St. Vlad's, his father went to St. Vlad's, in the OCA, is that the seminaries are actually starting to become conservative. And so my actual guess would be it's due to the degree of converts. They became Orthodox not because they liked communist ideology or all this stuff. They wanted the faith. And so what we're seeing could be a reversal, and it's already happening in the OCA. But in your opinion, is that something that you would concur with, or is this a big problem that's going to get worse before it gets better?
Well, among the clergy, I've heard anecdotally that's also true in the Greek Archdiocese, that the younger priests are much more conservative than the previous generation. And that's probably partly due to the influence of the Elder Ephraim's monasteries around the country. I think that the problem that we have is probably not so much on the seminary level as it is just in terms of our children getting an education in your typical university these days and then taking those ideas home with them. Because I can tell you, I see the children of ROCOR people on Facebook making comments where they're parroting social justice warrior bullcrap, as if it's the gospel. And in some cases, these are the descendants of people who fled the Soviet Union and ought to know better. But they're getting this indoctrination. And so what we have to do as a church is start educating our people on why the stuff is bad, and also looking for alternative ways of educating our children. And it's not just universities that have been taken over by this kind of stuff. It's the public schools. And I'm sure in California, it's 10 times worse. But I have a person in my parish who teaches in a very conservative school district that's not in Houston. I'll just leave it at that. But it's a more suburban school district, and this teacher was sent to a English seminar that was hosted in the big convention center here in Houston, the George R. Brown, and he showed me the catalog of seminars that you could go to. And almost everyone, if not everyone, was some kind of social justice warrior bullcrap. What was humorous was they couldn't decide on whether it was LGBTQ or LGBTQ.
Hey.
I mean, they were totally inconsistent with how many letters of the alphabet soup they were going to throw in there for the sexual minorities. But it was all that critical, race theory, being an advocate for this, be it, and he even mentioned there was a teacher that also teaches in the same school district as him, who in some seminar he attended was saying, I believed this stuff for years, and I've been trying to sneak it under the radar screen, and was talking about ways that you could do that. So if a suburban school district in Texas in a very conservative, very red area has teachers getting indoctrinated in this kind of stuff, if they didn't already get indoctrinated when they got their university education to begin with, they're getting it thereafter, and it's becoming an increasing problem. And so I tell my people, do not put your kids in the public school if you can help it. And if you do, the only way you can get them out with any hope of them being a Christian is if you watch over their education like a hawk and try to counteract the bullcrap that they get taught on a regular basis. You can't just go on autopilot and assume that the school is going to raise your children for you. You've got to take charge of it, and better be to homeschool or to put them in a private Christian school where they're not going to get this kind of indoctrination.
And hang in, these days you're paying the tax dollars for public school, and they're sending you home anyway. So you might as well get out.
And that's probably, that's one of the good things about this lockdown is I think a lot of people have gotten an education on what kind of an education their children have been getting, because their children have been home and they've had to help them a lot more with their schoolwork. And also a lot of parents have sat in and listened to some of these Zoom class sessions where they hear the teachers spouting this kind of crap and they never would have heard it before. So that's woken a lot of people up, and there are a lot more people homeschooling than there used to be.
And this also isn't. I'll just speak from my background, my parents. This isn't my parents' generation where you're dealing with parents that are first and second generation Americans. They only worked with their hands, and they go, well, I'm not an educated person. I trust the teachers. They're educated to teach my kids, right? Come on. These days, everyone my age is pretty well educated, probably more educated than the people teaching our kids, right? So we don't need to entrust these experts. They know these highfalutin intellectual ideas. What can I teach my kids? That ain't true anymore. And the resources
if your kids
are
got
out there.
a poor education in homeschooling and they remain Christians, you would be doing them a favor as opposed to having them go through a public school where they wind up becoming LGBTQ atheist advocates because they and Marxists, because that's what they've been fed, spoon fed.
And this comes. I'm sorry. Well, and this connects to the life of the saints, where Saint Monica, Saint Augustine speaks of quite negatively why he wasn't baptized sooner in life, and there's two particular periods where he felt he could have almost been baptized, and his mother didn't. His mother wanted to get an education, and tacitly she understood if he goes to Carthage to go get an education, he's going to be doing things that are sinful. I don't want him baptized yet. So, for the sake of his worldly secular betterment, right, he could have lost his soul.
Yeah.
And that's really actually the story of the first 30 years of St. Augustine's life. And that's a saint. So St. Monica could make that mistake.
Right.
So we have to prioritize our own salvation and our children's salvation before worldly success.
And these days you have so many options. Even if you don't want to homeschool your kids yourself, or at least primarily homeschool them, there are online Orthodox schools that you can put your kids into. And so you can basically do what the public schools are doing right now, but have an Orthodox teacher on the other end teaching your kids, and then you would just need to help your kids with the material. There's also tons of good homeschooling material that's available. There's lots of good programs that you can use, and you don't have to be a genius. You just have to learn. If you know how to read, write, and do math, you could easily homeschool your kids up to a certain grade level, and then when they needed something beyond your ability, then you might need to start getting them involved in something else. Like there are homeschool co-ops where you have some, like in a typical homeschool co-op, you might have a parent who's a former teacher themselves, and so they might teach science or math, and then maybe you teach some other subject. So you work together with other parents to try to draw on your own skills to give your kids a good education. But if you think about the kind of education people used to get in this country, back when we had one-room schoolhouses, and you had one teacher trying to teach children of all kinds of different age levels, and you look at the literacy that those kids had, like by the time they were in the 8th grade, they were way beyond our public school kids. So you almost can't do worse if you put half of an effort into doing it.
Yes, and that's what a lot of people have figured out during the COVID shutdown.
Yeah.
But what scares me most about what we're talking about in education and why this is slowly taking over religious institutions and our whole society is this isn't like the past where all they wanted was submission, right? If really like the reason why is it wherever the Turks were or even the Arabs were, the Christians didn't have it good, but they weren't completely annihilated, right? It's sort of like you paid your tax, we stay out of your face, mostly. Oh, of course, over centuries with the benefits of converting, you lost people. But compare that to the 20th century, where if you didn't toe the line, they would just annihilate everybody. And they almost successfully annihilated the church from Russia, for example. And what's the difference? It reminds me of something George Orwell writes about in 1984, which is we don't want submission. We want your minds. We want to tear minds apart and put them back together again. And that's what we're seeing now. It's not good enough to tolerate other people. You have to love them. You have to love Big Brother, not just submit to him. You have to love him.
Right.
And I think that's the difference. That's why this is so powerful, because it's relentless. It's like a constantly nagging life.
I think it was C.S. Lewis that said that it's far better to be under the rule of a tyrant than it is to be under the rule of someone who thinks that they're tormenting you for your own good. Because if they think they're tormenting you for your own good, then they can sleep at night with the approval of their conscience as to what they're doing. It used to be said of Puritans that a Puritan would lie awake at night troubled by the thought that somewhere someone was having a good time. Well, the descendants of those Puritans, or these social justice warriors, they've lost their faith, but they haven't lost their assuredness that they're right. So now they lie troubled at night that there might be someone out there who's going to vote contrary to their wishes or has thoughts that conflict with the way they see the world, and so they want to get their minds right or to destroy them.
There's a lot of truth to that, because like the Ivy League schools and the academe, years, centuries back, Puritans, then they became the Unitarian Universalists and the Congregationalists and all this stuff, and now those are the people that really started all the colleges and everything in this country. So that's really where at least culturally it originates from. So that's an interesting point. A friend of mine that's a priest also, you speak to him for 30 minutes, it always beelines to that exact point too. But let me ask this before we get to maybe some questions from the audience, which would be, what do you deal with someone who is, right, you're their spiritual father and they are struggling with this, or they believe in this, or they deal with some of the sins that are amongst these issues, right? What in the Orthodox Church is a sin is considered a matter of social justice in the secular sphere. So are we being too tough on some of these people? And how, in a pastoral way, do we help people, because they're in this world, but also in the church?
Well, I think the first thing that priests need to do is to make sure that they're talking about these kinds of issues so that their people don't just grow up being ignorant. Unfortunately, I think in most churches, not just the Orthodox Church, but in most Christian churches in this country, the case has never been made from the pulpit or in the Sunday school classrooms for why homosexuality is a sin. It might be stated that it's a sin, but they don't actually engage the issue in a way that tries to persuade people that the teachings of the church are correct. And so you've got people who grow up hearing only one side of the argument, and then essentially being won over, and they might continue to go to church because maybe they just out of habit and maybe some sense that, I still believe in God, but I think the church is wrong on this issue. But that's a result of a lack of proper education on the part of the church. Now, when you have people like that in your church, obviously you have to deal with this in confession. And if somebody, for example, if somebody is a homosexual, they have to believe that homosexuality really is a sin if they're going to be able to repent of it. And so you've got to explain to them that it is a sin and then work with them on the repentance side of it. But the problem is, if they don't believe it's a sin, they're not going to repent of it. And that's unfortunately a generation of people are being raised up with that very view, and it's being encouraged by people within the church, like the public Orthodoxy folks and a few other people, that either wink at this sin and kind of hint around that it might be okay, but don't really come right out and say it, or they come right out and say it. And that's where we are right now, and we have to engage this.
St. Augustine said, and I believe it's in Handbook of Faith, Hope, and Love, that there's a real danger that what is sinful could be considered laudable.
Right.
Right. And that's what we're getting to, is what is actually bad, which will prevent you from being saved. You won't know because you'll just think it's actually the right thing to do. And that,
the prophet Isaiah said, "Woe unto you who call evil good and good evil." And that's where we are as a culture. It's, sins that we've always understood to be such are being praised as good and admirable things. And people who are advocating for traditional morality are being called evil bigots and haters. And so we have the direct fulfillment of what the prophet Isaiah was talking about right there, calling evil good and good evil. And you obviously are not going to save your soul if you buy into that kind of thinking.
I think people have to realize that what is right, what's wrong, it's not these arbitrary rules and God doesn't want you to have fun or something like that. It's not coincidental that fornication, adultery, homosexuality, all these things are sins. Why? Because what is the Christological reality? It's a marriage between a man and a woman, because that's Christ in the church. That's what it says in Ephesians 5. Why would you want anyone to not experience that sacramental reality, to have that oneness with Christ, right? And so it's not a matter of being bigoted or not liking fun or just having these weird taboos that have been just there in time for too long. It's no, there's a Christological reality at stake. We want to have the life of Christ. We want other people to have the life of Christ. These are not arbitrary rules.
Are self-destructive. I believe it's in the Wisdom of Sirach or Solomon, I can't remember which, where it talks about the fact that sins contain within themselves their own punishments. And for example, if you live a life of drunken debauchery and drug abuse, you're going to destroy yourself. We understand that. We know that that's where that heads. Well, if you live the life of a homosexual, you're going to have a short life in all likelihood, because the lifestyle is inherently destructive. It's destructive in many ways physically. It's also destructive emotionally and psychologically. And that's why even in countries that have totally embraced the LGBTQP XYZ agenda, they still have a huge suicide rate among homosexuals. They still have huge drug addiction and alcohol rates among that segment of society, because it's a lifestyle that promotes that. And so why would anyone want to see someone that they love go down that road? It'd be just like if you have someone who you love and they're a heroin addict, the last thing you want to do is affirm them as a heroin addict. You don't want to see them continue to do heroin, because you know it's going to end with them dying very young and miserable. You want to try to get them to turn around and go the other direction.
And it doesn't mean it's easy either.
Right. I mean, no addictive sin is easy to overcome, but some people trying to overcome it better than giving into it.
Yeah, some people criticize, like, oh, then that means you're into conversion therapy, this or that. You know, I'm not an addict and I'm not a homosexual, so I can't speak from experience. But so I know addicts, and they will say it never goes away. You just don't do it every day, right? And so that might be that's some of our existence is some sins, right? It's you really have victory over sin where you don't even desire it anymore. But I think if we're going to presume most of this audience is heterosexual, and let's be honest, heterosexual males most likely, you don't just stop liking women one day, even if they're, not your wife. You just have to not think about it every single day. And so that's an idea of like, well, people deal with the other sins and different temptations. It's a great, like St. Joseph the Hesychast had, complete victory where he had no sexual lust whatsoever. It's recorded in the spiritual life by Ephraim of blessed memory.
Right.
Some saints do attain that. Some of us don't. And so you struggle with that every day. So that should give us empathy, but it also shows us the way forward.
If your average male gave in to their base passions, they would be wanting to have sex with almost every woman that they meet. But we train our men in the church to resist that temptation, and it wouldn't get you very far to tell your wife that caught you fooling around with some other woman, "Oh, I was born this way."
It's true, but
no, I'm not gonna accept that, my dear. I'm afraid that's not a good excuse. You were born with choice. You have freedom, and even though it's a strong temptation, you can resist it. And same, we know that people can be born with a predisposition to alcoholism, but if you get pulled over by a cop and you're smashed drunk, going before the judge and saying I was born this way is not going to get you off the hook.
And it's because in original sin, right, we've lost perfection, but we've not lost the image of God. We have free will, and we have, according to our nature, goodness. We could do good according to our own natural capability. So there's no excuse when we sin. We're completely liable for those things, whatever those things may be.
Right.
So being that we covered that topic, if you're ready, let me give you any last words if you want them, and then we'll do some audience questions if you have the time.
Well, I just think that we all need to take this a lot more seriously than we are. And I think the last year has woken a lot of people up as to how serious this stuff is, hopefully not too late. But I've been telling my people in my parish for quite some time that they need to start preparing for life in the catacomb church, because we may live to experience it. And the thing is, if you prepare for it and it never happens, it won't be wasted effort. You'll just be a better Christian for the effort. But if it does happen, it's going to be too late to start trying to prepare when you're already in it. When a hurricane's coming, you have to have already trimmed your trees, because trying to get a tree trimmer when the hurricane starts blowing doesn't usually work very well.
Well said, Father. So it's and I would just say, in my end, it's so many people just rely upon the priest or the bishop or the institution for their spirituality, and people have to own their own spirituality. Now, I'm not saying not be submissive to authorities. That's not my point. Point is, what if they go away, right? Like in Soviet Russia, what do you do?
Which could happen.
You know, right? You need to be a self-starter. You need to take this stuff
We've had a
seriously.
foretaste of that this last year. Many people suddenly found themselves in a situation where they could not go to church. And that could wind up being a permanent future for a lot of people. And so now is the time to start preparing for it. Hopefully you don't live to see it, but if you do, it's better to be ready than to be sorry.
I might be too extreme, but I think what's going on now is a spiritual genocide. The souls that will be lost. There's humble people that just, because the way they're brought up, I show up on Sunday, doors closed, I guess I don't show up. You know, I could speak to myself during Lent, my inability, even though my wife and I were always able to find a Sunday liturgy, the inability to go to pre-sanctified, to go to Vesper services. It's, even though you did the fast, you could find spiritually you were not as close to Christ as compared to a regular liturgical season. I don't know what to call it. And so if it's spiritually harming me, I know I'm not the only human being out there. It's spiritually harming other people.
It broke a lot of habits. And I've had people in my parish that have told me that they now have much more difficulty getting their children to go to church than they had before. And particularly if you have a spouse that's not at least an active Orthodox Christian, that makes it a lot more difficult to get those kids back into gear. And so we've definitely suffered a lot of damage as a result of it. But the point that I'm making is this could be the future. And so if you don't get ready for it now, you're gonna go into the storm with what you've got. And if you go into it with almost nothing, that's what you're gonna have to make do on, and it'd be much better to be prepared.
So, and that's a good point, right? You prepare for the blizzard by buying 2 loaves of bread and 2 things of eggs, 2 gallons of milk. You got to prepare spiritually for the storm coming. So we got a question from Emil. Should we worry about an extreme anti-liberal reaction among ultra-conservative converts to Orthodoxy that introduces an Islamic-like ethos? Father, are we in danger of having like ultra-crazy zealots that are going to go too far the other way?
Well, I think we've long had ultra crazy zealots, but fortunately they're the minority. But in terms of worrying about it as like a mass movement, I'll start worrying about it when I start seeing signs that that's actually manifesting. I don't see any signs to that effect. What I'm seeing is an underreaction. And it's an underreaction that's many years in the works, and we are way past the point where we should be seeing a strong reaction.
I mean, there's obviously, my opinion would be, Emil, there's obviously some weird stuff, like there's more than the average amount of anti-Semitism within conservative Orthodox circles,
right?
And racism within conservative Orthodox circles. Let's just stay in the obvious. And that doesn't mean they're bad in any other way. I'm just focusing on one thing here. But also a lot of them, kind of, no offense to some old calendarists, they find their way into old calendarism as well. So I don't see it as much as an issue, global Orthodoxy, though it still exists more than the average amount.
Right.
Especially because of the Slavic countries and their histories after World War II and all that fun stuff.
Obviously, we want to fight extremism wherever we see it. I just don't see it as being a big problem on the whole. But where it exists, I've spoken out about it, and I will continue to do so.
It's, I know, it reminds me of this, if it makes sense. My wife said, I saw a YouTube video and, the child door lock was there. And so she couldn't get out in a whatever fantastic situation. I said, I heard of this situation about a kid where there was no child door locks and he fell out of the car. So what's the more likely problem, right? It's going to be the child locks there because kids fall in the back of cars. So yes, the other stuff could happen, but that's like a speck on the radar screen compared to what else we're dealing with.
Right.
We got Slazo. My political ideology is socialism, but I am a Christian. Is that utopian or wrong?
Well, it depends on how far you go with it, because, if you're in favor of having Social Security benefits or some kind of a safety net for people, I might quibble with you on some points, but I wouldn't say that makes you a heretic. But if you want socialism in the sense of the government controlling all the means of production, and the government controlling your education and controlling your healthcare, then I would say that that's the antithesis of freedom, and you're not going to have religious freedom in that kind of an environment. It's going to be oppressive. So it depends on how far you go with it. But communism is basically socialism, but it's slightly different in terms of how it gets there. But the end goal is the same, and the end goal is not one that's compatible with being a Christian and being able to practice your faith freely.
My comment would be James chapter 4 says that friendship of this world's enmity with God. So if you're seeking for a worldly system that's going to fix all social ills and all that, it really becomes a substitute religion. It's not a coincidence that socialism seeks to indoctrinate and control and captivate minds. Right? You don't see this, I want this economic system, but we're going to let people educate themselves. No, it's always totalitarian because it's a competing worldly religion. But it's not a sin to be stupid. So if I'm wrong, it's not, my political ideology, that's not sinful. But I'm going to guess that James chapter 4 pertains more to the socialists than it does to the libertarians.
The only way you can have a successful, completely socialist society is to have an all-powerful government. And the chances that government's going to be promoting the Christian faith and piety is, I'd say, close to zero.
Or to quote Marx from the Communist Manifesto, he says, or to have an ascetic fervor, right? So like you can maybe get it working in a monastery, but you're not going to, right? But they all have a God they're working for, right? It's in a sense of holiness that you're not going to have in the world.
That's why the social justice warriors, their idea of what they want to see, I mean, it's a false religion because basically they want the kingdom of God, but they want it without God. But there's a lot of Christian influence that is behind communist thinking, and so the idea of living in a society where everybody shares and that kind of stuff, that's great on paper, and if it's voluntary, that's wonderful. It's just that when you have the government forcing everybody to do it, it's not voluntary anymore, and how could you, for example, have charity in a society where everything was under the government's control? You wouldn't have the freedom to be charitable because the government would be controlling everything. So that's the problem. A monastery is a communist society in a lot of respects, but it's a Christian communism, and it's voluntary. Nobody's putting a gun to anybody's head. Nobody's taking your stuff. It's freely giving.
Oh, but the nonsense. True anarcho-syndicalism is completely voluntary. It's the definition of a voluntary society. But people don't get it, so we got to put guns to their heads.
Right.
We got a question from Savardis, and in any of these questions, you have to say pass. Please do so. This might be redundant, but could you explain more about Fordham? Like, what's the scene there?
Well, it's up there in Yankee Land, and it's controlled by it's a Jesuit college, and so you might think because it's private that it would be insulated from this kind of stuff, but it's totally controlled by liberals. I think the president of the university was married to a man, and so it's Catholic in name only, and the Orthodox Institute that they have there is Orthodox in name only, and they've gotten a lot of influence in the last several years because they get promoted by the Greek Archdiocese to a large extent, and you see Archbishop Demetrius before, and now Archbishop Epaphroditus promoting them, showing up at their events, never saying a discouraging word for any of their promotion of homosexuality and other perversions. So it's a really bad picture. And these people have a lot of influence right now, at least in some sectors of Orthodoxy.
I don't know so much about Fordham specifically, other than I used to pass it by on the train all the time.
Yeah.
Hence my Bronx hat tonight. But that aside, Archbishop Epaphroditus, however you pronounce the name, because I can't pronounce any name, For example, back in Greece, he was the one of the professors, if not like on, I forget what they're called, the ones that do your doctrinal thesis with you, your advisors, to Father Christian Kops, who is the head of a seminary, the Uniate Seminary in Pittsburgh. And not so coincidentally, he's a convert to Uniatism, and he's pretty much Latinizing Uniatism. And so this is very subversive. I think it's purposely subversive. So I don't know too many details about Fordham specifically, but this is something that is happening throughout Orthodox and Byzantine Catholic education. Is they're trying to get people all on the same page.
One other thing about Fordham that people should know is St. Vladimir Seminary actually has a relationship with them, and Father John Meindorf used to teach at both institutions, but obviously at a very different time than the one we're in now. But there was a hieromonk in the OCA who was at St. Vladimir Seminary who wound up marrying a man. And unfortunately, at least one professor at St. Vladimir Seminary congratulated him when he got married to this man. And he was kicked out of seminary, thanks be to God. Unfortunately, that professor is still there, and he ought to not be. But he went to Fordham. And you know what Fordham did? Fordham used their agreement with St. Vladimir Seminary to force St. Vladimir's to allow him back on campus to take classes there. So you talk about a thumb in the eye, but that's what they did.
I mean, let me ask a stupid question, Father. Why are these people excommunicated?
They should be, and it's unfortunate that we have, too many gutless bishops that don't want to do that. I mean, it's one thing to be pastorally patient with someone under some circumstances, but obviously there has to be a line somewhere. And if you got someone who is openly promoting heretical teachings, at some point there ought to be okay, this has gone far enough, and if you don't shut up, you're no longer going to be able to approach the chalice. And I would say not even just shut up, but you need to renounce this false teaching, because otherwise, how can we have communion with people who are not on the same page in terms of sharing our faith? That's what communion is. If we don't share the same faith, we can't have communion.
There's problems, that's for sure. Now, RC asks, is it wise to stay in the Greek Archdiocese if it's the only option? I just want to premise this with that Father John belongs to a church that is not in communion with the Greek Archdiocese. Do you want to give an opinion on this or no?
Well, the thing is, it's obviously going to depend on your circumstances and the nature of the local parish. There are some really good priests in the Greek Archdiocese, and if you didn't have anywhere else to go, I don't think that it would necessarily be wrong to go there if you had a really good priest. Although, quite honestly, if I was in that situation, I don't think I would do it. But I can't blame someone who might be so isolated that they feel the need to go to a church like that. But I couldn't be in a church where they were commemorating Patriarch Bartholomew, because he's crossed the line into heresy in more ways than one. And I just couldn't do it in good conscience. I would rather stay home and pray and do reader services. But I've known people who are in that situation, and if that's what they feel like they need to do, I don't blame them. I don't think that means they're outside the church, because although we have the beginnings of a schism, it's not a full-blown schism yet, although I think that's where it's headed. And I see no signs of the ecumenical patriarch repenting of what he's done, and I don't think it's going to end well.
I could say, speaking for myself, if during a second shutdown, if the only church that was open was Greek, I'd worship in the Greek church. So would I have a bias to seek other options? The answer would be yes. But probably the best spiritual advice is usually things are different on the parish by parish level. You could have a great spiritual father in the Greek church. And so you need to be open-minded about that and not just paint all with one brush. But when you have stereotypes, they're not completely useless. So you also can't be surprised if you see some pretty, stuff that don't look so good in a Greek church. I remember a Greek church, I won't say where they actually had leftover communion for everyone came late, and it was called leftover communion. So there's stuff that Oh, and also, if you want to eat before communion, that's fine. That was said right before the chalice. So, like, all the stuff to minimize how important the sacrament is was occurring at this church. But I would say the worst Orthodox church on earth is still better than the best Protestant church or the best Roman Catholic.
No doubt about that. And I would also put the Ephraimite monasteries in a different category. I wish they did services in English more than they do, because I think they're still pretty much all Greek. But if I was a layman and I lived near one of their monasteries, particularly during the lockdown, if they were the only parish that was open, I would probably go there for communion. But I think they're in a different category, and I also have a feeling that they're going to wind up on the right side of this schism when it's all said and done too.
Now, I just want to put this as a comment. This is a viewer from Greece named John. When's this guy sleep? So great show. Good, great to have you on. Let's see if we have any more questions. They have to start arguing with each other in these things. Off topic. What's your view on Halloween, Father? That's actually a question I have.
I have mixed feelings about it. But I can tell you my kids never celebrated it. But on the other hand, if I had a trick-or-treater that knocked on my door on Halloween, I always had some candy to give to them because I didn't want to be a killjoy. And I remember as a child participating in Halloween, and it was fairly innocent when I was a kid. I remember dressing up as underdog one year, and I don't think that was worshiping the devil, going door to door and getting candy dressed as underdog. But that was a cartoon character for people who are not old enough to know who Underdog was. But I think as time has gone on, it's become a more clearly evil holiday in terms of the way that people actually celebrate it. I remember I went to a Christian college, and even on the campus, the people that were participating in Halloween, they were either dressed up as ghouls, demons, or they were dressed up as whores. And none of it was good. But theoretically, if you had your kids dressed up as totally innocuous characters and you did totally innocuous stuff, I can't say that it's worshiping the devil to do it. I just didn't do it because I didn't want to get my kids involved in it and then have it develop into something where it started getting into the mainstream of what Halloween's become.
Yeah, I'm sure the viewers could hear my kid, so he's still too young for this to be really a pressing issue in my family. One thing that concerns me is the only saints that knew about it when they commented on it's always universally negative, which gives us one view. But it's also like there's only so many. There wasn't Halloween in Russia. They're commercializing this stuff, so by now there could be some sort of equivalent now. But it's
the Russian version that was somewhat analogous to Halloween is during Cheese Fair. You had people dressing up in different kinds of outfits and going from house to house and getting goodies and stuff like that. But it didn't have the demonic element to it.
It's the tough part is you can't control what other people do. But then
Right.
you walk into the store and you see all sorts of things that are immoral and wrong. There's only so much you could avoid the fact you're in this world of people doing bad things. So, I'm going to ask my spiritual father when the time comes what to do. My personal sympathies, which could be wrong, would be towards there's so little things in the 21st century where the community actually goes and does something outside where that almost may outweigh, as long as you're positive when you do it, then taking the stand against it.
Right.
Because we're losing pretty much every positive social institution there is. And it's a shame that even Halloween could start meeting that bar. But maybe I'm wrong, and I'll run that by my spiritual father.
Right.
We have a question here. Just I think our last show was about this, so don't feel like you have to give a categorical answer. But what's preparation look like? I presume before communing.
I think he's talking about preparation for the hurricane that we were talking about.
Oh, all right. How about you give us the answer to that question?
Well, I think it means learning how to do the services on your own. And educating yourself in the faith and educating your family and taking responsibility for that in your home. And if you acquire the the knowledge, which it seems baffling when you're new to it, but it's not as complicated as you might think. If you learn how to do reader services, it'll be beneficial for you no matter what happens. But if you are not able to go to church, it might be the only thing that keeps your children Christian. And so I think it's very important that people start learning how to do the services at home. And I'm told that the old believers had a tradition that you weren't a man until you had your own set of service books and knew how to use them. And I'm not sure if that's really true or not, but it's cool if it isn't cool enough to say that that's what we ought to have as an ideal, that you're not a man, you're not the head of a household if you don't know how to do the services and have your own set of service books.
Now, the same question asks, what if your church leaders are afraid of the powers that be? Other than pray for them. We know that.
Right. The thing is you can only pray for your bishop, and I'm sure that the allusion there is to the coronavirus stuff, and I think we have to give the bishop some leeway for the fact that when this whole thing was coming down, we didn't know how bad it was going to be, and we also didn't know how long it was going to be, and so I could understand why bishops would have felt like, if you have a diocese and you are led to believe that if you don't shut down services, limiting them to 10 people and having the services broadcast on the internet for everybody else, if you're led to believe that if you don't do that, you're going to wind up with hundreds and maybe thousands of people that are under your spiritual care that are going to die as a result of it, I can't blame a bishop for feeling like, well, maybe I ought to shut down the services for a while. And when the shutdown first happened, I think most people were thinking we're talking about a couple of weeks. And then a couple of weeks led to a couple more weeks, and it led to a couple of months. And now we still got some people who've been shut down for more than half of a year and no end in sight. So I think at some point, you got to hope that bishops are going to start realizing that this is more than just caution about a virus, and start looking for ways to get around the oppression of the government, because that's what it is in California, especially right now. It's just oppression.
And my little pet peeve would be, we got to be kissing our icons. We got to be communing. We got to be praying. The worse it is, the more we have to be doing these things. I think what we've been going through right now is just absolutely faithless.
And when you see bishops that are encouraging their parishes to remove icons from being on the stands to be venerated, you have to start wondering what they're going to say the next time the Sunday of Orthodoxy comes around, because they're doing the same thing that the iconoclasts were doing. I mean, I don't see how you do that with a clean conscience as an Orthodox bishop, or keep denying your people the sacraments for months when you had the option of giving it to them. I think that's insane. I mean, at least, in my diocese, we never were in a situation where we couldn't give people communion. And we were locked down as far as not being able to have open services for about 5 Sundays. And, whether I agreed with that or not, I'll leave that to your imagination. But I had to be obedient to my bishop, whether I liked it or not. But I'm glad that my bishop always gave me the option of bringing people communion. And I don't see how any bishop could say it's okay for people to go without communion for months and think that that's a good thing.
I'll just make a couple comments. One would be, if you could buy a nickel bag, a dime bag, whatever, I'm not a drug addict. You could buy your drugs that are now legal. You could buy your liquor. You could buy your pint of ice cream. If all that stuff is somehow essential, worshiping God's essential, that is absolute. We got to put our foot down.
Right.
And if whatever reason you're obeying a unjust law, as long as you're free to say something about it, you could at least say, we are doing this because we have to. It isn't right. We're more essential than the liquor store, than the CBD store, and all the other stuff that exists today.
So like I said, I think it's become more clear that the continuing lockdown is just oppression. than it was in the early stages. And I could see why people who are just trying to be of goodwill and trying to do what they thought was best might have had a different take on how things should proceed. But shutting down for 6 months, this is not something that should be going on, and there should be no bishops that are okay with shutting down services for that length of time when they have the option of doing anything different.
It would just, and another thing would be that in both of us, well, I'll speak for myself. Actually, no, I won't say this right at moments so people know my reference. I'll just say this. Hire a lawyer. There's ways to get around these laws, creative ways. Heck, they had protests in the streets getting around this stuff, right? So it's just a tiny, minute amount of creativity would be able to keep worship going. There has to be the will to do it. And I think for some reason there's been this utter lack of will, and I don't know why, and I won't speculate because I don't know why.
Well, one thing I would say is that it certainly is possible that some bishops are doing that very thing, but they're just not advertising it to where we know it.
No, and I know that's the fact, actually, for some, but not all. And it's true for some parish priests and not others. That's why you want to be careful not to judge your bishop, because you might not know what he's actually doing and what he's actually allowing and permitting to occur.
That's exactly right. We don't really know, and we won't know until down the road when people are freer to talk about this. Unfortunately, there are Protestants that are in some ways putting us to shame because they're actually fighting this very publicly. But if you think about it, one thing they have that our bishops don't, and that's they have a lot more money at their disposal than our bishops typically do. So John MacArthur, for example,
it's a
can hire attorneys to fight the state of California and probably will ultimately win. But I don't think very many of our bishops have that kind of money. But like I said, I hope that they're at least trying to find ways to skirt the restrictions.
I would say I'm in New York, and I know a thing or two about a couple bishops in New York, and we're not going to guess, but they were allowing people to do the right thing. All right. Good. But they weren't advertising it. Don't be an idiot. Right. So don't judge. It's not, you could judge the situation, say that it's wrong. You can say if the icons are going to, you can say it's wrong, but don't be so sure of what any given individual is doing.
Right.
We got this question, which would be, what do we do essentially if the government starts essentially saying it's illegal for us not to commune homosexuals or not to marry them?
Well, ultimately, you have to be prepared to go to prison and be shot if it comes to that. Obviously we want to do whatever we can to avoid getting to that point, but there's some lines that you just can't cross. And in the Soviet Union, there were many occasions where priests were faced with choices that they couldn't go along with the government, and they just had to accept the consequences. They also, of course, had a catacomb church that expanded whenever these kinds of oppressive things were forced on the church that was allowed to function above ground. And then when the church was given more freedom, the catacomb church would start to shrink. So it was sort of like a balloon where you squeeze one side and the other side gets bigger, and then you squeeze this side and the other side gets bigger. That's how the catacomb church and the above ground church functioned for quite a bit of the Soviet period. But ultimately you just can't comply.
Well, Father, I think that finishes our questions for tonight. So if you don't mind, could you give us plugs to your websites?
Well, the parish website is www.saint spelled out, SAINT, Jonah.org. And my blog spot is FR John Whiteford, I think, at blogspot.com, if I'm remembering correctly. But if you just Google my name, you'll find it. My website also has a link to the blog too, so you can get to it that way.
And guys, you can rewind this video for the vast preponderance of it. The website was rolling on the bottom of the screen over and over and over. So you have it there. Well, Father John, it's been a real pleasure to have you on tonight and talk about this touchy issue. I'm appreciative that you take it upon yourself to do that and deal with the consequences, because it's not a popular view. So let me just thank you on behalf of the audience.
Well, thank you.
Well, guys, thank you so much for watching tonight. I'll end the show by quoting what I quote at the end of every show, which is Sirach 4:28. Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you all. Have a good night.